Hey, everybody. Welcome to Healthy Conversations. I'm your host, Travis Christofferson. This podcast series brings health experts from a variety of fields with the primary focus of disease prevention, health span, and health optimization. In other words, how do you look and feel your best? Our very first guest, is Dr. Jason Fung. Dr. Fung is a researcher and a New York Times bestselling author with 5 books now: The Obesity Code, The Complete Guide to Fasting, The Diabetes Code, and his latest book, which is the one we're going to talk about today, The Cancer Code. This book and this interview, I really can't say how much I enjoyed them. They were absolutely fascinating. The book really is this sort of sweeping historical and scientific exploration of a very simple question, which is, what is cancer? And by that, we mean the exact molecular, cellular events that conspire to create the disease. And this is so fundamentally important to understand because out of that, everything is dictated: cancer treatments, cancer prevention, everything. What I enjoyed was how Dr. Fung brought into this narrative all of this sort of epidemiological data research from multiple angles. And it was almost like puzzle pieces that sort of coalesced to give insight into how cancer behaves. I particularly loved the section towards the end where he walks through the events that we now know happen over decades that lead to the culmination of cancer. It's almost like it's story within a story. And if you have read cancer research, you realize it's presented almost like pixels. And this book takes those pixels and sort of coalesces them into a movie that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what I appreciated so much about the book and the way he presents in the interview. And we also talk a lot about the risk factors that relate to cancer, the most important ones. And surprisingly, dietary is one of the largest risk factors with regard to cancer prevention. So we talk a lot about that, particularly in the context of insulin, which is important to everybody because I think most know now that the standard American diet is very heavy in its promotion of insulin. So we kind of drill down into that topic in regard to the context of cancer risk. And finally, this interview series is brought to you by Avert. Avert is a physician-led prevention program within Stage 0 Life Sciences. Avert centers on the detection of the earliest predictive markers of cancer and chronic disease using a very comprehensive panel of blood markers that look at metabolic function and inflammation, and a novel early-stage cancer blood biopsy. This is a company that I am part of, and I'm very excited about because it's a unique collaboration of physicians and scientists with a very specific mission of keeping people healthy, prevention. And we are very grateful that Dr. Fung has helped in this mission as one of the members of the Avert Science Advisory Board. So without further ado, let's get to the interview with Dr. Jason Fung. Jason, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Now, you were in Toronto where, in addition to writing books that the world can't get enough of, you're a full-time nephrologist? Yep. You're one of these people that make us all feel lazy. It's really interesting now that I have the chance to work with a lot of physicians. The time management skills are incredible. They can squeeze more into an hour than I can into a week. Is that something that just comes with medical school and residency and practice?
I think it's just when there's a lot to do, then you have to be a bit more efficient on everything, probably.
Hyper efficient. We're going to talk about the Cancer Code, which I believe is the 4th book. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the 3rd one I've done by myself. I did some with other people, but
okay. Now, at the outset in the book, you say this book is a story of the exploration of cancer. And what I appreciated, what I enjoyed so much about the book was you return to this simple question over and over of what is cancer? And as you and I have talked about before, this seems to be something that gets kind of marginalized in the cancer community. I mean, this disease has been studied to death. When you type in cancer and do a PubMed search, there's over 3 million hits. And you get the impression that there's this overwhelming repository of data on these very specific things, like looking at the trees instead of the forest. And what I appreciate is that simple question where you look to connect these dots. You're looking at the trees in context of an entire forest. And what I think is what you did so well is the story is incredibly instructive. And what I mean by stories is sort of historical narrative of humanity's understanding of, again, back to the simple question, what is cancer? And you have a wonderful quote, and this again is constantly throughout the theme of the book, is the most pressing question of cancer research remains the most elusive. What is cancer? And so this story, again, is scientifically fascinating, trying to understand what cancer is. And there's a lot of good dramatic scientific stories. For example, the search to understand what space-time gravity is in physics. And Einstein came along and sort of overturned the Newtonian version. And it took decades and was highly charged, dramatic. But with the cancer narrative, there's this added dimension to not only the scientific understanding of what are these cellular events that conspire to create cancer, but the life and death struggle that marches alongside of it. The dramatic, lives are at stake, and the therapies spin out of our understanding of cancer. So let's start there. Let's start with what in the book you called version 1.0 of cancer. What was this version 1.0?
Yeah, so these are what I call the cancer paradigms. And, paradigm's a word that gets vastly overused, but it's really the way we understand the disease. And it's important because the way you understand the disease sort of tells you how you're going to treat the disease. So, for example, if you have a disease like a bacterial infection, then your understanding of that disease as a bacterial infection is important, because then you're going to use antibiotics, as opposed to as if it were a metabolic disease, of course, then you would never use antibiotics. It would simply make no sense. So it's really important to understand sort of what we think is causing the cancer, what the cancer is, because that's going to tell you how to treat it. So the first great sort of modern paradigm of cancer was simply as a cell that grows excessively. So it's a cell that grows too much, and that was, sounds sort of trite, but it's how we look at it. And if you look at sort of the ancient paradigms, they were quite different. Differences in humor and all this sort of stuff. But if you look at this disease as simply a cell that grows too much, well, then you say, well, how are you going to treat it? Well, the answer is simple: you kill it. You have too much growth, you try to kill it. And that's really, even today, the mainstay of cancer treatment. So what you try to do, of course, is you try to cut it out, which is surgical treatment. You try to burn it, which is radiation. And you try to poison it, which is chemotherapy. So those three sort of pillars of even now, of modern oncology, are basically ways to selectively kill cells. You try to kill the cancer slightly faster than you kill the patient. That's really it. Because if you give chemotherapy, it's really just a poison that attacks those cancer cells a little bit better than they attack your regular cells. You give too much, you get all the side effects. You get your hair falling out, you get the ulcers in the stomach, you get the nausea, you get the vomiting. And those are all the side effects. And it's not to sort of minimize this paradigm. It was quite important. The development of chemotherapy and different ways to combine the chemotherapy still, they sort of revolutionized the treatment of cancer. Things like Hodgkin's lymphoma and a lot of the pediatric cancers, of course, are treated quite successfully with various regimens of, drug A plus drug B plus drug C plus drug D plus surgery plus minus radiation sort of thing. So, but that is the way you look at cancer. By the 60s, things started to change a little bit, and we started to go sort of one level in knowledge deeper. That is, what we wanted to do was understand why these cells were growing, right? So that these cells are growing is not in dispute. What we're trying to do is understand the sort of why of what's happening. And of course, with the revolution in genetics, what we began to understand was that it's due to genes. So we have genes that control growth. So those were discovered, and they're called oncogenes now. So they're actually natural genes that turn on growth. And there's also genes that turn off growth, and these are called tumor suppressing genes. So when you activate those genes, they'll actually slow things down. So you basically have an accelerator sort of and a brake. So if you turn on this gene, it's going to accelerate growth. If you turn on this gene, it's going to be like a brake and it's going to slow down growth. So the whole point is that once you understand that, this is a problem in the gene that is controlling the growth, and that's why things are growing too much, then you can have entirely different treatments. And that's sort of the next great paradigm, which is cancer paradigm. I call it 2.0, which is the genetic paradigm, which is that this is a genetic disease, and therefore we need to look at these genes and try to turn them on and off. And by the sort of 90s, we started to get these new treatments, and there was a couple of just incredible treatments that we came up with. One was Gleevec, or imatinib, which is a drug used for a certain type of leukemia. Very, very, very successful. I mean, it was just a total game changer, really. And what it did was there was a specific genetic defect called the Philadelphia chromosome, which led to this abnormal protein called the BCR-ABL protein, and they developed this drug to counteract that protein. And when you gave it, and it is a pill, you basically cured like 90% of this cancer. And that was just unheard of. Like, it was like, wow. And what you're doing is you've changed paradigms. So what you're doing is you're no longer trying to kill cells. You're trying to fix the gene problem, which is totally different. The toxicity is much lower, so you could give this drug. It had very little toxicity. And then you had another drug very soon after that, which was a breast cancer drug, Herceptin, which again didn't look at trying to kill cancer cells. It was trying to fix that specific gene defect. It was even more successful in a way because not only did they target that gene defect, but they actually couldn't treat everybody, because not every breast cancer would have the HER2/neu gene mutation. So what they did was they developed a test to see if they had this mutation. So you weren't simply treating every single patient with cancer, because not everybody's going to benefit. And this sort of ushered in the era of personalized treatment.
Let me quick summarize. So the version 1.0, paradigm 1.0, we knew that cancer was pathological cell growth. And the treatments that spun out of that, obviously, were surgery, which has been around for a long time, radiation now over 100 years, and chemotherapy, which really came around World War II. Then Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of DNA. It was known that there was mutations in cancer. Version 2.0 paradigm was this somatic mutation model where these sequential mutations rewire the cell towards proliferation and give it the hallmark features of cancer, right? These 8 sort of consistent phenotypes that we all see all the time in cancer. So this set this theoretical paradigm. We target these mutations. We had these home run successes in Gleevec, Herceptin, and the era of targeted medicine was ushered in. And all of this led up to 2006, on the heels of the Human Genome Project. Genome sequencing became so efficient and cheap that we could now actually entertain a project called the Cancer Genome Atlas. And this, at this point, was almost like an engineering project. The theory we thought was locked down. So we could find these mutations specific to each cancer type, develop these targeted drugs. What happened then?
Yeah, and at sort of by the 2000s, there's this huge optimism that we're just going to cure cancer this way, because we had finally found that we'd moved past this sort of first paradigm. We'd gotten to the genetic paradigm, which was the somatic mutation theory. And so what we thought was that, hey, for each type of cancer, what we're going to do is we're going to find the 2 or 3 mutations that are key. And if you find that, then you can find a drug that's going to block it or alter it in a beneficial way. And therefore, you will cure cancer. It's just a matter of finding the mutations and then developing or finding those drugs that are going to target those mutations. But, we had the whole world working on this, tons of money was being developed on it. And so it was really just a matter of time. So with the Human Genome Project, it took them years to sequence the genes of one person. And that was a huge breakthrough at the time. But of course, the technology moved so quickly after that a few years after that, they started the Cancer Genome Atlas, because they said, well, first of all, everybody's genes are different. So what you want to know is you want to take each cancer and each person and sequence those. I think it was like 33,000 cancers and like all different types and all different this. And they're just going to sequence them all. Because if you got a couple thousand tumor samples, sequence them, then you could say, okay, well, this is the one gene that is responsible for sort of like 70%, and this gene is worth 20%. And then you could block them, right? And that took them a few more years. They finally published their data, I think, in 2018. And of course, there was very little success in terms of real treatments that improved patients' outcome after that. And it wasn't because there were too few, they couldn't find the mutations. We could find the mutations, no problem. It was because there were just so many mutations. I mean, they keep a database of all these mutations. And instead of like, so if you took colon cancer, instead of like 2 or 3 mutations, there were like hundreds of mutations. The total number of mutations, I think, in this catalog, and it's still growing, of course, in 2018 was something like 6 million different mutations. Well, that's a real problem because now you can't create 6 million different drugs. Each drug takes 15 years to develop. So it's like an impossible task. So not only that, but each cancer didn't have 2 or 3 mutations. It wasn't like if you developed a cancer, you had this 2 mutations and you could use those 2 drugs. Each cancer, like a colon cancer, these are common types of cancers, might have 100 different mutations. So again, impossible to go from knowing that to a logical treatment because you can't treat that patient with 100 different drugs. And the other problem, of course, is that there were like millions of mutations. So this person, A, in chemo clinic with his 100 mutations of colon, and you know, the patient B with the similar looking colon cancer would have 100 mutations, but completely different than patient A. So again, it's a completely impossible task to go from knowing that information to developing rational, logical treatments for people. And that was really how that whole somatic mutation theory really fell apart. It failed to deliver a lot of meaningful drugs. There were some very good ones, but something like 5.
And it struck to the heart of cancer theory as well. I mean, from a theoretical standpoint, it looked like a checkmate. The intertumoral heterogeneity that you talk about from patient A to patient B, and the intratumoral heterogeneity, meaning within the single tumor, there could be wildly different mutations. And metastatic sites, again, even more mutations. And so you write of this time, the stalemate in cancer stands in stark contrast to the dizzying progress in other areas of medicine. From 1969 to 2014, total deaths from heart disease dropped approximately 17%, despite increasing population. But cancer, during the same time period, deaths from cancer rose a chilling 84%. James Watson noted in a 2009 New York Times opinion piece that cancer killed 560,000 Americans in 2006, 200,000 more than in 1970, before the war on cancer had begun. So it was a deflating time period, right? I mean, especially in contrast to we had those first 2 home run drugs that you talked about. But then you go on to say, then we started winning. After 2014, cancer death rates began to drop. And you attribute this to, again, a slowing in cigarette smoking, but also to a new paradigm, a new understanding of cancer that allowed sort of new therapies to be developed. And this is to the sort of final episode where we are today, this version 3.0. So let's talk a little bit about that. What has changed and what is this new understanding of what cancer is?
Yeah, the third sort of major shift was to go from a purely genetic, so the somatic mutation theory. The way they imagined cancer developing was that you had a single cancer cell. So say you had breast cancer. So you have a breast cancer cell, and it sequentially gathers the necessary mutations to become a cancer. And this was one of the things that it would predict is that each cell after that, so after it gets all the necessary mutations, then it would it would become cancer, and then all of the subsequent cancers would be genetically very similar. That's important because then the entire solid tumor mass is all going to have the same mutations. And when you treat that with a drug, the entire mass is going to be affected. It wasn't true in any way. When you actually took a tumor like a breast cancer, there was multiple subpopulations. So within that primary tumor, you might have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different types, like different genetic profiles. The breast cancer that had metastasized would have a completely different profile from the one that was in the breast. The breast cancer that had moved to the lung, for example, looked completely different. So even within one patient, the different sites of cancer would have different mutations. The nodal, like the lymph nodes, would have different mutations, and within the tumor, you might have multiple different mutations as well. So this whole idea that you had a single genetic mass, it didn't hold true. And the other thing so somatic mutation theory said that it was all sort of genetically homogeneous, and it said that these mutations were picked up randomly. And this is a big problem. So, because if you think about smoking clearly one of the big causes of cancer, it's not targeted mutation. It's not like smoke goes in and says, I'm going to target this gene and change it in this way. It's just a non-specific sort of chronic irritant, right? That's what tobacco smoke is. So why is it causing mutations within growth genes? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And if it's purely random, why do cancers look all the same? Like, if you go in and you say, okay, well, here's some paint and go paint something, and 50 people paint exactly the same thing, like down to the brush stroke, well, there's nothing random about it. So if you have cancers that are developing, so in person A, person B, person C, and so on, in the thousands of people, they are all very similar. Like, cancers look more like each other than the people look like each other. The cancers are very similar. So therefore, there's nothing random about these mutations. They must have been targeted in some way, even though the way they got there, like the genotype might be completely different, but the phenotype was always the same. And this is preserved through history. So if you have a black man in 2020 and a Japanese woman in 1920, they could be different sexes, different, races, half a world apart, 1 century apart. Those 2 cancers will still look identical. Well, how is that possible? Right? It doesn't make any sense if they were all purely random mutations. So this whole somatic mutation theory just didn't make any sense at all. But worse, it didn't come up with enough good treatments to slow down the rate of cancer. So the third so everybody sort of had to go back to the drawing board. So clearly there were genetic, mutations. That's not the issue. What you're now trying to understand is, again, trying to go sort of one step further and say, why are these genes mutating, right? And that's how you get to the sort of third great paradigm, which is this evolutionary paradigm, which to me is a totally fascinating story. Like, it makes a lot of sense. It answers a lot of the things. And what this theory says is that, in fact, the genes mutate, but it's a directed sort of mutation, just like evolution. If you think about evolution, suppose you have 2 birds, and this is from Darwin, so this is how he discovered it, supposedly. So if you have 2 birds and one of them lives on nuts, they all have very thick beaks. The ones who live on fruit have very, very thin, long beaks because it's easier to eat the fruit. And the reason they develop is because the environment selected those mutations that are advantageous. So in that environment, which had nuts, favored the development of those thick beaks. So when you had a spontaneous mutation that produced a thicker beak, it would be have an advantageous survival. The environment, which has has a lot of fruit, favors the thinner, longer beaks, right? So it's the environment that tells you which mutations are going to develop. And this takes you out of the purely genetic, right? So in the somatic mutation theory, there's no consideration for the environment at all. It's simply a number of random mutations that are coalescing at the same time. And the reason they coalesce, they say, because if you have a, smoke, it's increasing the rate of mutation, and therefore you're getting more mutations. That's why you're getting more cancer. But it doesn't sort of explain why those mutations are all the same mutation and they all look the same and they all sort of converge on this thing. Whereas in the evolutionary theory, you're saying that, well, all of these mutations are directed at surviving in this environment. So now you're sort of looking at not only the sort of seed, but also the soil, which is a much more comprehensive way of looking at things. And this evolutionary paradigm then says, okay, well, if it's mutating, then what is the sort of selective pressure? What is the environment? And what are these mutations? So there was a lot of work in the sort of 2010s looking at sort of, one, what are these mutations really like? What's the sort of rhyme or reason of mutations? And the whole thing sort of got started in 2000, the sort of the beginnings of this theory, when people started to look at what makes a cancer. And this was sort of a revolutionary thought. And it's interesting because, you have cancers like a breast cancer and a liver cancer. They're quite different. So they have different staging systems. They react differently. They behave differently. In 2000, two researchers decided that, hey, let's like, these are all different diseases. Breast cancer is different than liver cancer, but they're both cancer. So what are the commonalities? Let's not look at the differences. Let's look at the commonalities of what makes them cancer. And this became sort of the most cited paper in the history of cancer research. And these were called the Hallmarks of Cancer. That was the paper. They revised it. They added two more. And there were sort of 8 hallmarks of cancer. And it's important because now you're starting to look at cancer as a unified disease as opposed to 30 different types of disease. Right?
That was a striking realization for me, just simply from the fact that when you're talking about cancer being a collection of a random process of mutations, and the mutational profile is so different from one cancer to the next, how do you get this consistency, right? Those 8 hallmark features all the time. Yeah. And you describe it so well in the book about the seed in the soil, this evolutionary process of cancer. And I think it's important to note that what this is talking about really is cancer was described as a forward evolutionary process. And this new sort of paradigm looks at it as a backward evolutionary process. In other words, these seeds of cancer, we all have within every cell. And what they are, step back one second, life builds evolutionarily. So the majority of the planet was unicellular life. Then multicellular life came along, and these cells had to sign contracts with each other to live in a collective. But we still retain the genes for unicellular, I'm sorry. And those are the seeds within us. And so you describe it so well. I love the part of the book towards the end where you just walk through the stages of cancer from a molecular level. And it takes an irritation. It takes a sublethal chronic damage. The cell begins to revert back to the survival mechanism, right? These early genes of unicellularity. And that makes sense from this, what you're so good at is this top-down view of cancer. That makes sense with these hallmark features. You have this consistency because these genes are being upregulated. And now the mutational process comes into play. And now you can knock out a gene like P53 or KRAS, and it, of course, shifts the cancer towards a cancerous phenotype, but it's not necessarily required, right? Half of cancers do not have a P53 mutation. So that seed is so important that I can't stress enough, I think, how this understanding of cancer is so critical to our knowledge of how to treat it. And now, then you shift in the book to the soil. which I think is so interesting. And you go back to a time, I think the mid 80s, there was two epidemiologists in the UK who looked at the root causes of cancer and were able to narrow it down to, well, what is it different? What's different about the soil that's causing cancer? Of course, tobacco smoke, I think, accounts for about 35% of all cancers. But then diet, they found that diet plays a role of 30%. So what is it about? You go through then began this quest to find what is it in the diet that is carcinogenic, that can make the soil more fertile. You go through fiber, fat, vitamins, and then you finally go to this link between obesity, diabetes, and cancer. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's the interesting part, is that we've always known that the environment actually plays a huge role, which makes sense if you think about it as an evolutionary disease, because the environment is, of course, what is the most important thing. So we've always known that diet plays a role. And the thing about the somatic mutation theory that was so sort of detrimental in a way is that how it sort of ignored the role of environment. But at the same time, you had to say, well, we know a lot about what causes cancer. They're called carcinogens. We have huge lists of carcinogens: tobacco smoke, asbestos, soot. So there's these massive lists of carcinogens, and then at the same time, people were saying, well, it's just a random genetic event. It's like, what are you talking about, right? That doesn't even make any sense. So when you look at the list of carcinogens, those two researchers said, well, diet is 30%. That's a huge number, because tobacco smoke, of course, is very important. Everything else was like 2%, like all this stuff that we think is important, the chemicals and the pesticides and the radiation and stuff. Not that they're not carcinogens, they are carcinogens. But in terms of magnitude of importance, there's only two that are super, super, super important: tobacco smoke. And so that's what really caused a lot of the downturn in the mortality of cancer, of course, was people stopped smoking. So we found that out sort of in the 60s, 70s. It didn't really take hold until probably the 80s. And then you still had this lag where people are still smoking. And that's why lung cancer is still the top killer. You think back to days, I mean, you sort of shudder these days now, right? But you'll remember when airlines had those little ashtray things on the seats.
Yeah, well, you doctors were promoting. I remember there's a commercial with the doctor in the white coat saying Camel cigarettes were less irritating.
Yeah. So it was crazy, and you remember these things like the smoking and non-smoking section of the restaurant, because those little walls would prevent the smoke. So it took a long time for that, but it did happen, and of course that does play a huge role. But then the other huge one, so just behind it at 30%, is diet, and it gets almost no play. Not that we haven't looked, but we looked for all these different things. So we spent a long time looking at dietary fat, of course, because dietary fat was the villain of the day, right? It was causing everything. It was causing heart disease, turned out not to be true. It was causing obesity, turned out not really to be true. And therefore, hey, of course, it's going to cause cancer. So that turned out not to be true either. And we spent a lot of money and a lot of time. And there are several massive studies looking at colon cancer, looking at breast cancer, and you couldn't really put a link between the two. It was very, very hard. So then they looked at other things, and again, spent massive amounts of money looking at cancer as a vitamin deficiency disease. So practically every vitamin was tested. So they gave people vitamin A and vitamin B and vitamin C and vitamin D and vitamin E and vitamin K and omega-3s. You name it, they tested it. And these trials, of course, which a lot of were published in the really top-notch medical journals, they take like 10 years to do and like $50 million. Like, these are big studies.
The one that I liked the most was theoretically, it's a beautiful study, right? Cigarette smoke is oxidizing, creates free radicals, which create mutations. So let's give smokers beta carotene, which is a potent antioxidant.
Yeah.
And then they gave smokers, there was a control group with no beta carotene, the treatment group with beta carotene. I think after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they stopped the trial because the smokers getting beta carotene were getting, I think it was 20% more cancer. So it just shows when we have this simple paradigm, human biology is incredibly complex, and there's always a law of unintended consequences. So that was a pretty illuminating study.
Yeah, it was in several studies too, in folic acid and vitamin
Mm-hmm.
Bs and stuff. You saw this increasing rate of cancer, and it was just, so it wasn't a vitamin deficiency disease the way that, say, scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. You give vitamin C, everybody gets better. But then what really turned out to be the one big link, and this wasn't really well appreciated until the mid 2000s, so it was very recent, because I did medical school in the 90s, and we were still talking about dietary fat causing cancer and stuff. That's what I was taught. And I was taught all about the somatic mutation theory and the 2-hit hypothesis, which turned into a 3 or 4-hit hypothesis, which really turned out to be a 100-hit hypothesis. But by the mid 2000s, there's a couple of big studies that were published, and they really pointed the fact that obesity, now, of course, the obesity epidemic was going way up, so it became a much, much more important problem than it was in the 70s. And the obesity turned out to be very highly linked to not every cancer, but many cancers. So lung cancer, of course, it had no bearing at all. But a lot of the important stuff, like the breast cancers, like the pancreatic cancers, colorectals, liver cancer, kidney cancer, endometrial cancer, all of them turned out to be highly linked to obesity. And not just specifically obesity, but hyperinsulinemia. So you can actually take normal weight people and segregate them on their, how much insulin they're producing, and of course the insulin would drive these cancer rates. And again, it's one of these things that became, it was totally sort of new in the 2000s, and by now it's actually a well-established fact. There's a number of cancers that are called obesity-related cancers, and they're listed by like the World Health Organization, so they're well known. And that, of course, is a huge problem for the somatic mutation theory, because being overweight or obese is not mutagenic. Like, having excess body fat doesn't increase your rate of mutations. It's just not, that had nothing to do with it. And but when you look at it from the sort of evolutionary paradigm, then it makes a lot of sense. All of these connections start to make a lot of sense, because insulin is a growth factor, right? So if it's a growth factor, you have a disease of excessive growth. If you're increasing the growth, well, you're going to get more. And there's actually a lot of different ways that it's related. So not just in terms of hyperinsulinemia and obesity, but also type 2 diabetes, which is also a disease of hyperinsulinemia. You'll also see this exact same increase in rate of cancer.
I found this fascinating. This is in the book. In lab studies, normal breast cells proliferate like crazy when they're incubated with insulin. And these are cells that normally don't respond to insulin. And if insulin is removed from breast cancer cultures, the cells shrivel up and die. Studies showed that high insulin levels, and you just talked about this, more than doubles the risk of cancer regardless of weight. Non-obese, non-diabetic people with high insulin levels had a 250% increased risk of cancer death. That's a pretty shocking number.
Yeah, it is shocking. And the important part about it, of course, is that insulin levels are clearly related to the diet, right? Some foods are going to increase your insulin levels. If you eat all the time, your insulin levels are going to go up. If you develop overweight and insulin resistance, your insulin levels are going to go up. So it becomes very important, because it's not simply correlation. It's actually something that we can do something about, because we can influence that from our diet, which is what those researchers found. Dr. Pito, or Sir Richard Pito, found sort of in I think it was the early 80s. And then they repeated the analysis in 2015, I think. And they said, well, basically all our original conclusions were right. Other than tobacco, the other thing you really have to worry about more than anything else is the diet. And of course, that connection with the diet sort of gets almost no play, because other than like pesticides and stuff. It's, but the actual mechanism might be much more related to insulin and so on. It's not a disease so much of mutation. It's a disease where you're putting, cells all have that seed, that cancerous seed within them, but you put them into a high growth environment, a very cancer promoting environment, and they're going to flourish as cancers. And that's
it makes sense. I mean, when you think about it under that perspective, there's some sort of irritant that's causing the cell to revert back to this different epigenetic expression. And then you throw on top of that growth factors, just this overfed environment that pushes a cell towards cellular growth, towards an anabolic state, right? And so, it makes perfect sense from that seed soil model. And it's interesting. I think you talked about a little bit in this book, other growth factors like insulin-like growth factor, which it responds from human growth hormone. It releases IGF-1, and that sets the body into an anabolic state of growth. And there's a very interesting sort of epidemiological study that you referred to. I think Walter Longo, he went and lived with in Ecuador, in the mountain regions. There's a group of people with Lorentz syndrome, which is a mutation in the IGF-1 receptor. So they don't respond to growth hormone. And they have dwarfism. They're very short stature. But despite a horrific lifestyle, high smoking rates, high rates of alcoholism, terrible diet, cancer is almost non-existent. Type 2 diabetes is almost non-existent. So it tends back to, we're doing something wrong, right? I mean, we are in this kind of overfed state all the time. And this brings back to your first three books about, well, I mean, it's a very simple explanation. Perhaps we're just overfed. Perhaps we don't need to eat as much and as often.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that is important, because now all of a sudden it's an interesting story. I mean, I think that the scientific part of it is actually completely fascinating to me. But it actually is important in another way, in that you can actually do something about influencing your risk of later cancer. And that's not something that we've ever talked about like before, because when we had this sort of, it's just a random mutation, it's just bad luck sort of thing.
Bad luck.
But it's not. There's something you can do about it. And of course, if you have an obesity-related cancer, if you're not obese, you're going to reduce. You're not going to completely eliminate, but you're going to reduce your risk of cancer. And it all falls out from this sort of chronic damage as the cell tries to become more like its ancestral sort of survivalist, past. What fascinated me too was, when I was reading about this sort of atavistic sort of theory, that this is actually an evolution of our cell towards a sort of earlier time, because that was when the cell was more sort of a survival sort of mode. When you look at how people describe cells pathologically, they had always used that term.
Primitive
right? Cells, right? Anaplastic comes from, the word anaplasia. Same thing. It's something that refers to something very early, very, very ancestral, primordial, right? You have leukemia cells, and when you see the leukemia cells, you don't see the mature cells. You see the very immature cells, right? So it's all this talking about a reversion to an earlier source, which I call that sort of kernel of sort of cancerous cell. But you have to understand that the cancer is not, it's a set playbook that we used sort of millions of years ago that worked well when we were single cells, works very badly when we're in a sort of multicellular environment, because basically the unicellular, as a single cell, you're trying to compete with the other cells. When you're trying to be a team, you have to cooperate rather than compete. As the cell turns into this sort of primitive form, it then tries to compete when it really, and that's why, your cancer cell will invade other places. It'll take over the liver. It's going to try and kill off the normal cells. It does all the things that you would expect from sort of an invasive species, which it in fact has become. And that's really fascinating, because Now you get into the sort of, okay, if this is cancer, which is an evolutionary disease, you can try to identify the environment which is promoting its growth, because evolution is all about the environment. And that is going to be very successful, like stopping smoking. That's going to be very successful. But if you can't do that, well, then what are your options for drugs? Well, your body has a huge system that's dedicated to fighting invasive species called the immune system. And when you can sort of toggle that, the immune system, you're going to be a lot more successful in treating cancer. And that's sort of why immunotherapy has become this incredibly important sort of area of research. Are we there yet? No, not really. There's still a lot to develop in terms of trying to get our immune system. But again, if you think about the paradigms of cancer, these immune treatments of cancer, they're not trying to kill cells. They're not trying to change the genetic mutations. They're trying to treat it like an invasive species that has evolved to become what it is, and therefore we're going to activate the immune system to try and kill it.
It's fascinating too, because the immune system was another, in addition to metabolism, was another branch of cancer therapies that was kind of shuttled to the side through most of the 20th century. And now has obviously made this huge resurgence. But there are all these clues, the toxins. I know that Paul Davies talks about, when you look back through the literature before sterile surgical technique, patients often got horrible infections post-surgery. And a lot of these cancer patients that got these terrible infections went into these dramatic remissions, and nobody could account for that. And those disappeared once sterile surgical techniques came along. So we had all these interesting clues along the way. And in the book, you give this, I love the clue. This is another sort of clue-like case where there was a 64-year-old with pulmonary fibrosis that received a lung transplant. And he received it from a woman who died when she was 51. The lung looked healthy. There was no pathology. It looked fine. He went on his immunosuppressive drugs when he received the transplant, but then they found out that the donor had melanoma when she was 21 and went into remission. And a year after receiving these immunosuppressive drugs, the transplant recipient developed melanoma. So it gives you this sort of idea where the immune system and cancer are in this constant balance, right? And we know from autopsies that micrometastasized cancer is much more ubiquitous than previously appreciated. It's in us. But there's this tension between the immune system and cancer all the time. And I don't think we appreciated that to its full extent. And the other thing that's very interesting is this abscopal effect, where you talk about from 1969 to 2018, there was 69 documented cases of the abscopal effect. The vast majority of those were reported in the last 6 years. And now, for the listeners, the abscopal effect is when you hit a single tumor site with radiation. Sometimes the metastatic sites will respond to that. And there's no good explanation other than you've exposed antigens to the immune system, and the immune system can latch on and then fight them. And so when you throw in a checkpoint inhibitor, like an immunotherapy like Keytruda, and you target a single tumor, this abscopal effect takes hold. And so that is a very, again, promising kind of treatment avenue.
Yeah. I think that's where you get to once you understand this evolutionary theory. Things make sense. So the abscopal effect, for example, if you have breast cancer, you radiate the breast cancer, and then then the metastatic lesion in the liver disappears. It's like, okay, that should never happen, because if it's a gene defect, your radiation doesn't do it, right? If it's just local damage from radiation, why would your liver lesion disappear, right? So it's clearly something more systemic, and you're exposing, basically you're breaking up that cancer. So the immune system gets a good look at the cancer and says, I'm going to go kill these type of cancer cells, finds them in the liver and kills them. So it makes perfect sense from that standpoint. And therefore now you can investigate ways that you can combine these treatments in a much more successful way, because you no longer are limited to sort of just, radiation just does this. Well, it also, exposes your immune system, and now you've got radiation plus your immunotherapy. So, and same thing with, instead of giving maximally tolerated doses, so the standard way we give chemotherapy is called MTD, maximally tolerated dosage, which is essentially give as much chemo as you possibly can without killing the patient. That's basically what it is. But it doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because when you give treatment, you are now putting a chronic sort of damage, because a lot of these are damaging. Chemotherapies are poisons. You're actually introducing a mu-selection pressure. Just like when you give massive doses of antibiotic, what do? You get resistance, right? Because everything starts to develop. So another very promising treatment is to actually just give enough chemo to keep things under control. And Dr. Gattenby has done some good research into that, and then you don't get the resistance that you see, same as with the antibiotics. So exactly the same process, and you can understand it, again, only if you understand the evolutionary sort of paradigm of cancer. So, just these fascinating treatments coming out of understanding it. And I always find it interesting because I've given some talks, and I'll tell you that most doctors, even oncologists, have never really thought about the evolutionary paradigm of cancer. They don't understand it. They just think it's another, they don't understand the sort of the importance of how it explains what it is that we're seeing. The other important thing, of course, is to understand that the metastasis is actually a super early event. It's not a late event, right? And this is important because of some of the stuff that we talk about. So when you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, what happens when you develop, say, a cancer? So you have a breast cancer, and the classical way we think about it is that the breast cancer gets bigger, 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 bigger. Some chunks start to break off and fly out into the blood and lodge in the bone or whatever it is. It's totally wrong. It's completely wrong. We know that, 100%. What happens is that the cancer, even before you can detect it, has already started showering out cancer cells into the bloodstream. The thing is that most of these cancer cells are very poorly equipped to handle the bloodstream. They just simply don't have the tools to exist. But every so often, one will become survivable enough to sort of make that loop. It travels the bloodstream and then gets back into the original site, the breast cancer site, where it's now protected. But what has survived has undergone evolution because it's been subjected to these evolutionary pressures, these selection pressures of being in that bloodstream. So then after years and years of this going on, what you get are different subpopulations of cancer developing, which explains exactly what we see in that breast cancer, which is that it's not a single genetically homogeneous population. It has multiple subclones within it because it's undergone round and round and round and round of evolutionary pressure. Now, eventually, one of them develops enough to lodge in the liver, for example. And if your immune system is strong enough, it's just going to live there. It can't survive. It can't grow because as soon as it grows, the immune system kills it, which is why that patient had the melanoma there sit there for like 20 years until she died of a car accident. And then as soon as they went into the immune suppressed host, the cancer, the melanoma, actually recurred like in 9 months and killed the poor guy. This is a cancer that had lived dormant for like 20 years. It never got killed, but it never survived to grow either. They couldn't detect it. And you can, again, only understand it once you understand the evolutionary side of it.
It's a powerful message.
It's a powerful message. But the other thing that's important, of course, is that maybe you can detect these cells in a liquid biopsy. So now we're talking about liquid biopsies, which is essentially taking blood and looking for these tiny, tiny, tiny concentrations of cancer cells to point you to the fact that you might have something brewing there. Because if metastasis is an early event, we can actually measure these tumor cells in the blood. They're very transient. Like they live like less than an hour. Like tumors, the cancer cells break off, they go into the blood, they get killed like right away. So, but the technology now has evolved to the point where you can actually detect them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. We've been right with the 5 pre-screening methods, colonoscopies, cervical. They've been around a long time. The fact that we're to this technology now where we can draw blood to detect cancer and get such a massive head start, I think, the early detection makes cancer 4 times more survivable because you can just go back to this simple cut it out. If you can you cut it out. I want to go back just real quick to fasting and about this soil hypothesis fasting, because there's interesting data about that has come out with Walter Longo. And you talk about fasting. I know ketogenic diets are being studied in the context of a cancer adjuvant. Simply from the context, you lower blood glucose, which is a preferred fuel of cancer, and tends to make chemotherapy, other things more effective. But fasting does more. It not you talk about it not only reduces insulin, which is critical, but it reduces all these nutrient sensing pathways all in one single fell swoop. So one of the interesting clinical studies from Walter Longo group is they had patients fast for 48 to 72 hours before chemotherapy. And I know he had a brutal time convincing oncologists to allow the study to go on. He did. And what he found was this dramatic reduction in side effects and objective side effects, things you can count, like the number of times a patient vomits, mouth sores, the amount of hair that falls out. And it was shockingly dramatic. And now this has moved on to not only the mitigation of side effects, but can this potentiate chemotherapy? And it does it in an interesting way. You reduce insulin, you reduce blood glucose, you set up this sort of differential where normal cells, healthy cells can shift to ketones. Cancer cells sort of struggle with that metabolic shift. So that's a very interesting sort of and cheap and free kind of thing that should be explored.
Absolutely. So fasting does so many things. So one, if you're not on like outside of the chemo part, it's going to lower the insulin, which is a growth factor. It's going to lower mTOR, which is also a growth factor, highly potent growth factor, I would add, and also activate AMPK, which is again one of these nutrient sensors. When your cell has a lot of energy, it has a very low AMPK, which is sort of an inverse thing. But that's how metformin works also on AMPK. So a lot of people thinking that metformin has some anti-cancer effect is relatively mild, especially if you get overwhelmed by insulin and mTOR and stuff. And just keeping in mind that this overfed state, so insulin not only for carbs, but also protein with mTOR. So if you have too much of that, it's not good. But with chemotherapy, it's especially interesting because fasting puts the cells into sort of this regenerative mode. So when insulin sensors, when nutrient sensors are low, your body, tries to stop growing. Because that's what makes sense, right? Your cells are sort of shutting down. There's no energy. So you go into this more quiescent state. You go into a slower growth cycle. And then when you hit them with chemotherapy typically affects those cells that are growing the fastest. So what you do is you try and put these cells into this slower growth mode. So when you hit them with the chemotherapy, they actually are going to have less damage because they're not growing as fast. So therefore, all the side effects like the hair loss and the vomiting. So vomiting often is because the cells of the GI tract, the epithelial cells within your GI tract are very rapidly turning over. So that's why this sustains so much damage. So you give chemotherapy, you kill the cancer cell, which is growing fast, but you kill the GI tract epithelial cells, the lining of the GI tract as well. So you get vomiting, you get ulcers and all kinds of stuff. So the fasting actually put them into a slower growth mode, so they'll actually sustain less damage. The the cancer, of course, can't do that because it's sort of programmed to go, 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 go. So therefore, it gets as much as you can. So you could do one of two things. You could actually tolerate it more, so you don't ever have to reduce the dose like you often do sometimes. So for example, when you treat people, sometimes you have to reduce the dose of chemo because they're just getting too many side effects. So if you're getting less side effects, you don't have to reduce the dose. and therefore you're going to get better effect on that cancer. It may actually improve the effect of it on the cancer as well, but that's a little bit more questionable. But again, here's a treatment that is completely free, has been used for thousands of years, that could improve the effect in a very specific role just before chemotherapy. The reason why, they had trouble convincing people is because you get this cancer cachexia where people lose weight with cancer, and that's a totally different process than it's not just eating, right? Because when you lose weight, your metabolic rate usually goes down. That doesn't happen with cancer cachexia. So as you lose weight, your body's just burning still as much energy as it does before. That's why the weight just goes down and down and down. It's a lot more complicated than just sort of, the calories and all that stuff. There's a lot more going on with cancer cachexia. And unfortunately, what happens is people say, well, therefore you should always try and feed people and stuff, and that's why you shouldn't fast. I understand that hesitancy, but with the understanding that we have and some of the clinical data that they've done, it seems like a pretty good effect, especially if you're going to limit that in duration to just sort of before the chemotherapy. But also for people who are relatively well, if they have, breast cancer or colon cancer, then they can apply the intermittent fasting to prevent recurrence, to try and reduce the risk of recurrence. So many different ways you can use it once you understand the sort of evolutionary paradigm.
Yeah. Well, we got through about half of what I wanted to talk about, but absolutely fascinating discussion. I thank you for your book. It was to me, just such a wonderful exploration of cancer. Again, back to the simple question, but these treatments and promising treatments that are spinning out of this. So we got to do this again, Jason.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Okay.
I'll tell you that I think the story itself, from a scientific standpoint, was just utterly fascinating. Like, before I wrote it, I had no idea, how far it had come and the implications it had. But it's just a fascinating
and still unfolding.
story.
It's funny. Every generation thinks that they're in the modern edge, and they are by definition. But you tend to stop there. Like, we know this, but we don't. I mean, we're still in the early innings of completely understanding what this is.
Early innings. I mean, so many people are still stuck in the somatic mutation theory. I talk to people all the time, and they're like, yeah, of course it's genetic disease. We know that. It's like, no, it's not. And honestly, what's interesting to me is that how few people know about it and how few people even talk about it, even within cancer researchers, right? Nobody cares. It's like, wow.
Well, that's why Davies was so refreshing. You have a cosmologist come along, right? The NCI funded that project to have fresh eyes look at this and hired cosmologists, and he came up with just some fascinating insights. And he didn't do anything novel. He just connected dots.
He connected
information
the dots
information that had been out there for a long time.
Yeah. The oncologists hate him, though.
Well, that's the early stage of every new paradigm. It always goes through those phases, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to your patients. They need you much more than we do. So thanks again, Jason. Take care.
Thanks. It's great talk, Travis.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.